On the morning of her 16th birthday, Sophie Carter woke up to a silence that felt heavier than the house around her. A silence that told her something was wrong before she even sat up. She walked downstairs hoping for a sign that her family remembered the day, but the kitchen was cold and empty, with dishes from last night showing 4 places where she was not included. She opened the fridge to get milk, and that was when she found the note stuck to the door in bright pink handwriting that belonged to her stepsister. "Dad's hosting brunch at the club. Don't come. Stay out of sight, freak," the note said, cutting her like a blade. Beneath it, written in her father's neat handwriting, were the words, "Megan will explain later," as if that made it better. Sophie stood there staring at it, whispering to herself, "Why am I always the problem in my own home?" Even though she already knew no one inside that house ever planned to answer her. Sophie remembered how everything changed after her mother died when she was 4, a memory painted more in feelings than in pictures. Her father remarried 2 years later, bringing Megan and her 2 children Ava and Luke into their once quiet home, and from that moment, Sophie slowly faded into the background. She remembered Megan telling her, "Ava needs the bigger room, sweetheart," and how her father nodded like it was obvious, never asking Sophie what she wanted. She remembered Megan removing her mother's paintings from the walls and saying, "We're redecorating," while Sophie whispered, "But those were hers, only to be ignored." Every year after that, there were fewer reminders that Sophie's mother ever existed, and fewer signs that Sophie mattered in the house at all. Even now, on her 16th birthday, the note on the fridge felt like the final proof that she was living in a place where love was rationed and she always got none. She tried to make the moment easier by baking herself a small cupcake using an old box of mix she found in the pantry, telling herself, "It's fine, I don't need them," even though she wished someone had said happy birthday. She lit a half-melted candle she found in the drawer and quietly sang to herself, but her voice cracked halfway through the song, making her feel even smaller in the big empty kitchen. She scrolled through her phone hoping for a message from her father, but the screen was blank except for old photos she kept of her mother. One picture showed her mother holding her as a toddler, both smiling, both wearing matching silver bracelets that Sophie now held close to her chest. She whispered, "I miss you, Mom," because the silence in the house felt too heavy to hold alone. Then at exactly 8:47 p.m. the doorbell rang, pulling her out of her sadness and into something she never expected. When she opened the door, a woman in her late 50s stood on the porch wearing a gray blazer and holding a thick brown envelope like it carried the weight of a secret. The woman looked at Sophie for a long moment before whispering, "You look just like her," and Sophie felt her breath catch as she asked softly, "Like who?" The woman introduced herself as Helen Brooks, her mother's closest friend and an attorney who had been searching for her for 12 years. Helen stepped inside slowly, her eyes scanning the house with a sadness that said she already knew Sophie wasn't treated well there. When Helen saw the note on the fridge, her jaw tightened as she whispered, "You deserved so much better than this, Sophie," in a voice full of quiet anger. Then she guided Sophie to the kitchen table and said, "I'm here because your mother left something behind, and your father has hidden it from you for your entire life." Helen opened the brown envelope and revealed a stack of old papers, a sealed letter, and a notarized document that made Sophie's hands tremble when she read the title, "Last Will and Testament of Emma Carter." Helen explained that Sophie's mother left everything she owned to her, including the house, a cabin, land, a trust fund, and a collection of valuable paintings, but her father concealed the will and pretended nothing existed. When Sophie whispered, "Why would he do that?" Helen answered softly, "Because he wanted control over what wasn't his, and because you were too young to know the truth." Sophie felt her chest tighten as she stared at the will, realizing her entire life had been shaped by lies from the people who should have protected her. Helen reached across the table and said, "Your father signed away his parental rights this morning, and that activated your mother's plan to protect you." Sophie swallowed hard, whispering, "So what happens now?" As Helen replied, "Now, Sophie, you and I start taking your life back." Helen explained that Sophie's father had filed the legal papers that morning to remove himself as her parent, and Sophie felt her breath shake as she whispered, "He really signed me away?" as if saying it out loud might make it less real. Helen nodded gently and said, "Yes, but his decision triggered the protections your mother put in place before you were even born." She laid the sealed letter beside the will and told Sophie, "This is from your mother, but you should open it only when you feel strong enough." Sophie stared at the envelope, feeling a mix of fear and longing rise in her throat, because the idea of hearing her mother's voice again scared her almost as much as it comforted her. Helen continued explaining the assets her mother left, describing land in Maine, a cabin in Vermont, and paintings that had been sold without Sophie ever knowing. Sophie whispered, "He sold her art?" And Helen answered softly, "Yes, and none of that money went to you." Helen told Sophie they had only 14 days to stop her father from transferring the remaining assets into a charity run by Meghan, something he planned to announce at a large gala with more than 300 guests. Sophie listened in disbelief as Helen said, "If he signs those papers on stage, undoing it later becomes almost impossible." Helen reached for her hand and said, "But we have a plan and you're not alone in this anymore," giving Sophie the kind of reassurance she hadn't felt in years. Sophie nodded slowly, feeling something unfamiliar stirring inside her, something that felt a little like courage and a little like anger. She whispered, "Tell me what I have to do," wanting for the first time to fight for herself instead of shrinking into the corner. Helen smiled sadly and said, "We go to court, we tell the truth, and we stop them before they take everything your mother meant for you." The next morning, Helen drove Sophie to her small office above a bakery, and the room smelled like coffee and warm bread as she opened a drawer stuffed with 12 years of documents. Helen showed Sophie a series of transfers her father made, each one moving the house into trusts and shell companies as if he were burying it under layers of paperwork. Sophie whispered, "He really planned all of this," and Helen replied, "Yes, and he counted on you never finding out." Then Helen revealed something even harder to hear. The education trust Sophie's mother made for her had been drained more than a year earlier to pay for Ava's tuition. Sophie felt her stomach twist as she whispered, "He used my college fund for her dorm?" Unable to understand how a parent could do that. Helen nodded quietly and said, "This is why we fight, Sophie, because none of this was ever meant for anyone but you." Helen showed her one last document, an email from Sophie's father to his attorney referring to her only as the girl. And Sophie felt something inside her break cleanly in a way that didn't hurt. It clarified. She stared at the page while whispering, "He couldn't even say my name," and Helen placed a steady hand on her shoulder, reminding her she was worth more than his silence. As Sophie looked around the office filled with proof of what had happened to her, she realized how small she had made herself to survive in that house. She whispered, "I thought it was my fault," and Helen answered, "It was never your fault, Sophie, not even for a second." Helen's phone buzzed with a new message, and after reading it she turned to Sophie with a serious expression. "The guardianship hearing is scheduled for the same day as the gala," she said, and Sophie felt her heart pound as she replied, "Then we win in the morning and stop them at night." Helen told her that after the hearing, they would return to Sophie's house because until the court granted guardianship, leaving without notice could create legal problems that might delay everything. Sophie agreed, even though the thought of walking back into that house made her chest tighten, but she knew this time she would return with the truth instead of fear. When she entered the kitchen later that day, Meghan looked up from her phone and said, "Oh, there you are, grab me a sparkling water," as if Sophie were a servant in her own home. Sophie opened the fridge slowly, noticing every detail. The family portrait without her, the fresh flowers her stepmother ordered weekly, the ring on Meghan's hand that she suddenly recognized. It was her mother's engagement ring, the one her father claimed had been lost, now shining on Meghan's finger like it belonged there. Sophie placed the sparkling water on the counter and whispered to herself, "Not much longer," knowing the truth was finally shifting in her favor. Over the next few days, Sophie moved through the house quietly, listening more than she spoke and watching the people who believed she knew nothing. She overheard Meghan rehearsing her gala speech about honoring Emma's legacy, and Sophie felt her hands clench at the hypocrisy. She watched Ava parade her new black gown down the hallway, saying loudly, "The gala is going to be perfect," without even looking at Sophie. That night, Meghan knocked on Sophie's door and said, "Sweetie, I think it's best if you stay home from the gala. You know how anxious you get." Sophie forced herself to nod, replying softly, "Okay," even though inside she whispered, "Not this time." She waited until Meghan left, then texted Helen 2 words. They refused. Helen replied immediately, telling Sophie not to worry because she had something from Emma's closet, something Sophie would need for the gala. For the first time in years, Sophie felt the possibility of standing somewhere she belonged instead of hiding from sight. The next day her father called her into his study, And the moment she stepped inside, she sensed he was trying to be the version of himself he showed to strangers. He said softly, "I know things have been hard, Sophie, but I found a school for you. A boarding school in Massachusetts where you can start fresh." Sophie stared at him, realizing he was trying to send her away before the gala could expose everything. She whispered, "Are you sure this is the right choice?" While inside she asked herself, "Why am I never the choice you stay for?" As she left the study, Sophie noticed a manila folder under her father's newspaper, and curiosity urged her to glance at it through the doorway. She recognized the heading, Carter Family Foundation, Asset Transfer Agreement, and snapped a quick photo before walking calmly upstairs as if nothing happened. Her hands trembled once she reached her room, but her mind was sharper than ever. She sent the picture to Helen with the message, "He's signing it at the gala." Helen responded within seconds, "We'll stop him. Stay focused." Sophie lay on her bed staring at the ceiling, feeling the shift inside her. The part of her that had whispered for years was finally learning to speak. She whispered to herself, "Mom, I hope you'd be proud." On Saturday morning, Sophie told Megan she was going to the library, and Megan waved her off without looking up, making it easy for Sophie to slip out and head to Helen's office. When she arrived, Helen had turned the small room into a war map with a whiteboard covered in dates, evidence, and arrows pointing toward the word gala. Helen explained the plan. Attend the guardianship hearing in the morning, secure the ruling, and use the court order that night to freeze all estate transfers. Sophie listened carefully, asking questions in a steady voice she barely recognized as her own. Helen then opened a closet and revealed a cream-colored dress Emma once wore, saying softly, "This is yours now." Sophie held the dress against her chest, whispering, "I can't believe she kept this," as Helen smiled and replied, "She kept everything for you." As the gala drew closer, the house felt heavier, as if the walls' new secrets were about to spill into the open. Late one night, Sophie went to the kitchen for water and was surprised to see Luke sitting at the counter, staring at his drink. He whispered, "I know you're planning something," and Sophie froze, unsure whether to run or defend herself. Luke kept peeling the label on his bottle and said, "I heard you talking on the phone last week. I didn't tell Mom because what they did to you on your birthday was wrong." Sophie stared at him, surprised by the first kindness she'd heard from him in years, unsure how to respond. Luke finally looked up and said, "Whatever you're doing, be careful. Mom fights dirty." Luke hesitated before adding, "There's something else you should know. Mom has a lockbox in her closet under her boots and it's not jewelry inside." Sophie felt her pulse quicken as she asked quietly, "What kind of papers?" But Luke shook his head and said, "I don't know, but she checks it whenever something legal happens in the house." He stood up to leave, pausing at the doorway long enough to whisper, "Don't trust Mom's cousin Richard. He's the one helping them set everything up." Sophie nodded silently, knowing this warning could change everything. When he left, she sat alone in the kitchen trying to understand whether this was guilt, compassion, or both. All she knew was that the house was finally cracking from the inside, and the truth was slipping through the cracks. Before sunrise the next morning, Sophie crept into Megan's walk-in closet, her heart pounding loud enough that she worried it might echo through the hall. She found the black lockbox buried behind a row of tall boots and spotted the small combination lock on the front. She tried Megan's birthday first, then her father's anniversary, but nothing worked until she typed Ava's birthday, 1019, and the lock clicked open. Inside were 4 items that changed everything. A photocopy of Emma's will with Megan's handwriting saying "Keep this away from S," an email chain about hiding estate details, a picture of Emma holding toddler Sophie, and a marriage certificate between Megan and another man. Sophie felt her hands shake as she photographed everything quickly, knowing she had minutes before someone woke up. She slipped out of the closet whispering, "You knew everything, and you still took everything." She called Helen immediately from her room, speaking softly so no one would hear her through the walls. Helen answered on the first ring and Sophie said, "She was married to someone else when she married Dad," barely able to believe the words herself. Helen responded calmly, "Send me the photo. This could completely change how the judge sees her involvement." Sophie emailed the pictures, her hands trembling with adrenaline as she whispered, "I can't believe they hid this." Helen reassured her, saying, "This strengthens everything. We go in stronger than ever." Sophie took a deep breath and told herself, "This is the last morning I ever let them silence me." Fairfield family court felt smaller than Sophie expected. A single room with buzzing lights and wooden benches that smelled faintly of coffee and old paper. She sat beside Helen, wearing simple clothes and trying to steady her breathing as the judge entered with a stern expression. Helen presented the evidence calmly. The original will, the signed relinquishment papers, Meghan's incriminating notes, and the transfer agreement scheduled for the gala. When Meghan's cousin Richard rushed in and argued that the estate had been lawfully restructured, the judge cut him off, saying, "This will is airtight and the concealment is deeply troubling." Then she turned to Sophie and said gently, "Your mother was a brilliant woman. I remember her from years ago." Finally, the judge granted guardianship to Helen and issued an order freezing all estate transfers, saying firmly, "This court protects the wishes of the deceased." Outside the courthouse, the April sun warmed Sophie's face as Helen handed her the envelope containing the court order they would use at the gala. Helen said, "Step 1 is done. Tonight we finish this," and Sophie nodded, feeling the weight of the moment settle in her chest. They drove back to Helen's apartment so Sophie could prepare, and when Sophie slipped into her mother's cream dress, she felt a strange peace wash over her. Helen pinned her hair gently and whispered, "You look just like her," and Sophie felt her throat tighten as she asked softly, "Do you think she'd be proud?" Helen smiled and said, "More than you know." With the court order in her bag and her mother's bracelet on her wrist, Sophie whispered to her reflection, "Tonight I stop them," before walking out the door toward the place where everything would change. Helen drove Sophie to the country club just before sunset, and Sophie held the court order tightly in her hands as the car rolled to a stop. The parking lot was filled with expensive cars, and music drifted through the open doors like a warning rather than a welcome. Sophie stepped out slowly, her mother's cream dress glowing softly under the evening lights as she whispered, "Mom, walk with me." Inside, guests turned their heads as she entered, whispering to each other when they recognized her mother's bracelet. Meghan's face turned pale the moment she spotted Sophie, and her father stiffened like a man caught in a trap he built himself. Sophie kept walking, determined to face the truth instead of hiding from it. Her father walked toward her quickly, forcing a smile that trembled at the edges as he hissed, "What are you doing here?" Sophie met his eyes and said calmly, "I came to hear your speech," refusing to shrink the way she used to. Meghan stepped beside him, trying to sound warm as she said, "Sweetie, you must be confused. This event isn't really for you." Sophie looked straight at her hand, the one wearing Emma's ring, and said, "You're wearing something that doesn't belong to you." A few guests nearby went silent, sensing a shift in the air. Her father grabbed Sophie's arm lightly and whispered, "Stop this right now," but Sophie only replied, "You shouldn't have signed those papers." The master of ceremonies called her father to the stage, and Sophie took a seat in the front row beside Helen, feeling the room tighten as the lights shifted. Her father began speaking about Emma as if he had honored her all these years, calling her generous and kind, while Meghan nodded dramatically in the front row. Sophie felt her jaw clench, knowing every word was meant to make him look noble instead of guilty. Then he held up a document, the estate transfer agreement, and said the foundation would receive everything Emma ever owned. Guests applauded loudly, believing they were witnessing something beautiful and selfless. Helen leaned over and whispered, "When he signs that paper we stand." Her father signed the document with a flourish, and the applause grew even louder, spreading through the room like a wave Sophie refused to join. Helen stood first, raising her voice just enough to command attention without shouting, and announced, "I have a court order from this morning freezing all transfers of the Carter estate." The room fell silent instantly as guests turned, confused and curious, then watched Sophie stand beside her. Helen explained that the estate belonged solely to Sophie according to Emma's original will and that the transfer was invalid. Sophie looked at her father and said clearly, "You hid her will for 12 years. Gasps echoed across the ballroom as guests began filming the moment on their phones. Her father stepped forward angrily, saying, "She's a child, she doesn't understand any of this," but Sophie didn't let him finish. She held up the copy of his signed relinquishment papers and said, "You're not my parent anymore. You signed that away on my 16th birthday." Meghan jumped up, shouting that the will was fake, but Helen revealed the photocopy from Meghan's lockbox with her handwriting saying, "Keep this away from S." The guests murmured louder and Sophie turned to Meghan and said, "You wore my mother's ring while helping him steal from me." Her father's face crumpled when he realized the room believed Sophie, not him. A single clap started near the back, then others joined until the entire ballroom applauded the truth. Sophie stepped toward the microphone and said softly, "I didn't come here tonight to humiliate anyone. I came because you were about to give away everything my mother trusted me with." She told the room about the smallest bedroom, the missing paintings, the empty birthdays, and the note that called her a freak on the morning she turned 16. Her voice didn't shake because she wasn't speaking to her father anymore. She was speaking to the girl she used to be. "I'm done trying to earn love from people who never planned to give it," she said, letting the truth settle across the room. Her father tried to speak again, but he had no audience left. Everyone had seen his lies unravel. Sophie stepped away from the microphone and whispered to Helen, "Let's go." As Sophie walked through the ballroom, people moved aside for her, many offering gentle nods or quiet words of support. Through the glass doors she saw Megan rushing to the parking lot, angrily dialing someone who clearly wasn't answering. Ava sat alone at the VIP table, wiping her mascara while glaring at Sophie as if the truth were somehow a betrayal. Luke stood near the exit with his hands in his pockets, giving Sophie a single quiet nod of acknowledgement and regret. Even though Sophie didn't smile, she felt something warm shift inside her, accepting the gesture. She left the ballroom with Helen beside her, stepping into the cool night air as the applause faded behind them. 1 week later, the court confirmed that Emma's will was valid and that every asset would return to the trust under Helen's guardianship until Sophie turned 18. Her father was ordered to vacate the Westport house within 60 days, and state investigators opened an inquiry into the attempted fraudulent transfer. Megan's involvement was exposed when the marriage certificate surfaced, raising questions about whether she had ever been legally married to Sophie's father at all. Ava's university fund was flagged for repayment since it had been taken from Sophie's education trust. Sophie listened to all of it quietly, not celebrating but letting the weight of justice settle calmly across her shoulders. She finally understood that winning didn't always look loud. It sometimes felt like breathing freely. Sophie moved into Helen's apartment temporarily, settling into a sunlit guest room with an oak tree outside the window and a desk where she began painting again. One afternoon she received a letter from her father filled with excuses instead of apologies and signed simply with his name, not Dad. She read it once, folded it neatly and placed it beside her mother's letter, choosing not to reply because silence was finally on her terms. Enclosed in the envelope was Emma's engagement ring, the same one Megan wore at the gala, now returned without a single explanation. Sophie slipped it onto her finger, feeling a quiet warmth bloom in her chest as she whispered, "You kept this safe for me." For the first time she felt a piece of her mother come home. Months later, Sophie visited the cabin in Vermont with Helen, walking into a space untouched by her father's hands and filled with Emma's paintings, brushes and quiet spirit. She sat on the porch wrapped in a quilt, watching the sunrise her mother once watched, feeling something gentle settle deep within her heart. She began painting again, discovering color and light the same way Emma once did, letting art become the place where healing began. At her new school, Sophie made real friends who didn't know her past, and she learned what it felt like to be seen without shrinking. She often thought about the girl she used to be, the one in the small bedroom eating alone, believing silence was safer than truth. Now, in the calm morning light, Sophie whispered to herself, "I'm enough," knowing her mother would agree and knowing her story had finally changed.